I'm going to tell you something no one would believe. My name is David Mitchell, and I'm 43 years old. What happened to me in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about survival, and about the thin line between legend and reality. It was late October when I decided I needed to disappear. Not permanently, but long enough to find some piece of myself I'd lost somewhere in the chaos of modern life. My divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier. My job at the insurance company felt like a slow death, and the city noise had become unbearable. I packed my Jeep with camping gear, enough food for 2 weeks, and drove toward the mountains without telling anyone where I was going. The cabin I rented was more isolated than I'd expected, 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became increasingly treacherous as it wound higher into the peaks. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, who looked like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves, handed me the keys with a warning about early snow and cell phone dead zones. I thanked him and assured him I could handle myself in the wilderness. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I woke with the sun, spent my mornings chopping firewood, and my afternoons hiking the endless trails that snaked through pine forests so dense they seemed to swallow sound itself. The silence was profound, not the artificial quiet of noise-cancelling headphones, but the deep, living silence of a place where human voices were rare and precious. I established routines quickly. Coffee at dawn, watching the mist rise from the valleys below. A long hike before the afternoon storms that rolled in like clockwork. Evenings by the fire, reading books I'd meant to read for years. I felt my shoulders dropping. Tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying finally beginning to release. But on the 4th night, something changed. I was splitting logs behind the cabin when I heard it. A sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a scream. It was something between the two, something that seemed to come from deep in the forest and deeper still in evolutionary memory. I stopped mid-swing, the axe heavy in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, musky, wild, but not unpleasant. Like pine sap mixed with something I couldn't identify. I looked toward the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, and saw movement in the shadows between the massive pines. At first I thought it was a bear. The size was right, massive, dark, moving with that distinctive rolling gait. But as my eyes adjusted to the growing dusk, I realized whatever was watching me was standing upright. Not occasionally, the way bears sometimes do, but consistently, naturally. And it was tall, impossibly tall. I should have been terrified. Every instinct should have screamed at me to run, to lock myself in the cabin, to get in the Jeep and drive back to civilization. Instead, I found myself frozen, not with fear, but with fascination. Because whatever was standing at the edge of the forest was watching me with an intelligence I could feel even across the distance between us. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Me with the axe in my hands, it motionless among the trees. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, it was gone. No sound, no breaking branches, just absence where presence had been. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the fire burning high and found myself getting up to check the windows. Though what I was looking for or afraid of finding, I couldn't say. The rational part of my mind catalogued possibilities. Bear, person in costume, hallucination brought on by altitude and isolation. But a deeper part of me, a part that felt older and wiser than my conscious thoughts, knew I'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything in a delicate crystal lace. I made coffee and sat on the cabin's small porch, scanning the tree line. In daylight, the previous evening felt like a dream, but when I walked to where I'd been chopping wood, I found them. footprints in the soft earth near the woodpile. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Large, certainly, but not quite human, and not quite animal. The shape suggested a foot, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the front. Each print was nearly 18 inches long and sunk deep into the ground, suggesting incredible weight. They led from the forest to within 10 feet of where I'd been standing, then back toward the trees in a different direction. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared where the ground became rocky. Standing there in the morning sunlight, staring at the last clear print, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that I'd never experienced before. I was either losing my mind or I'd stumbled into something extraordinary. That afternoon, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I organized my supplies, cleaned my gear, and tried to process what I'd seen. But as evening approached, I found myself drawn outside again, this time with my camera. If whatever it was returned, I wanted proof. I didn't have to wait long. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting them in shades of gold and crimson, I heard that sound again, closer this time, more complex. Not just a call, but something that sounded almost like language. If language could be made of wind and stone and ancient wood. I turned slowly, and there it was. Standing at the edge of my camp, no more than 30 feet away, was the most magnificent and terrifying creature I'd ever seen. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its limbs were impossibly long and muscular, its hands ending in claws that looked capable of tearing trees apart. But it was the eyes that held me. They were intelligent, not animal cunning, but deeply, profoundly aware. They held something I recognized as curiosity, and something else I couldn't name, but that felt almost like kindness. We looked at each other across that small clearing, and I understood with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something ancient, something that belonged to the mountains in a way I never could. My hands shook as I slowly raised the camera, but when I looked through the viewfinder, the creature was gone. I lowered the camera and found myself looking directly into those extraordinary eyes. It had moved. Silently, impossibly, and was now only 15 feet away. Up close, I could see the silver threading through its dark fur, the way its breath misted in the cold air, the careful intelligence in its posture. "Hello," I whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. The creature tilted its head, and I swear I saw something like amusement in its expression. Then it did something that changed everything. It sat down. Not collapsed or crouched, but deliberately sat, reducing its imposing height to something less threatening, more conversational. We stayed like that until full dark, neither of us moving, just existing in each other's presence. When it finally rose and melted back into the forest, I felt an unexpected sense of loss. The pattern continued for 3 more days. Each evening, as the sun set, my visitor would appear. We never got closer than that first near encounter, but each night it seemed more comfortable, staying longer, sometimes making soft sounds that I began to think of as conversation, even though I couldn't understand a word. On the 3rd evening, it brought me something. A cluster of pine cones arranged in what could only be described as a deliberate pattern. It placed them on a fallen log halfway between us, then retreated to its usual distance and watched as I approached to examine them. The pine cones were perfect, unblemished specimens that would have taken considerable time to gather, arranged in a spiral pattern that was both beautiful and somehow meaningful, though I couldn't grasp the significance. I looked up to find the creature watching intently, and I understood this was a gift. "Thank you," I said, and was rewarded with what I could only interpret as a nod. The 4th evening brought the first snow of the season, not the light dusting I'd been expecting, but heavy, wet flakes that began accumulating immediately. I was sitting by the fire when I realized my evening visitor hadn't appeared. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind was picking up. This was going to be more than a light snowfall. By midnight, it was clear I was in trouble. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the tree line, and the wind was driving it horizontally across the clearing. My Jeep was already buried under 6 inches, and the power had gone out. The cabin had propane heat, but I could hear the wind testing every joint and board. I woke the next morning to silence so complete it was disorienting. The storm had passed, but it had left behind nearly 2 feet of snow and a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. My Jeep was invisible under a pristine white mound. The road was impassable, and my cell phone showed no signal. For the first time since arriving, I felt truly isolated. Not the peaceful solitude I'd been seeking, but the stark realization that I was alone in a wilderness that could kill me with indifference. I spent the morning digging out what I could and taking inventory of my supplies. I had enough food for maybe a week if I was careful, plenty of firewood, and enough propane to heat the cabin for several days. But if another storm hit, or if the road stayed impassable much longer, I could be in serious trouble. It was while I was outside, assessing the damage, that I saw the tracks. They circled the entire cabin, massive prints in the snow, forming a complete perimeter around my small clearing. But these weren't the careful, distant approaches I'd grown accustomed to. These tracks came right up to the cabin walls, passed directly under windows, crossed the porch. Whatever had made them had been checking on me while I slept. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, I felt an odd sense of comfort. I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. That afternoon, while I was outside trying to clear a path to my Jeep, I heard branches breaking in the forest. Heavy footsteps approached through the trees, and soon my visitor emerged into the clearing. But this time, it didn't stop at the usual distance. It walked directly to where I was working and stood looking down at my futile efforts to dig out the buried vehicle. Up close, its size was overwhelming. The top of my head barely reached its chest, and its hands were larger than dinner plates, but there was no menace in its posture, only what seemed like assessment. It made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that felt like communication. Then it walked to the Jeep, brushed away snow with movements that were surprisingly gentle given the size of its hands, and examined the situation. After a moment, it looked at me and made another sound, different from the first. Then it simply walked away, back into the forest. I stood there in the snow, confused and a little disappointed. But an hour later it returned, and it wasn't alone. 3 more creatures emerged from the tree line, each as magnificent and impossible as the first. They moved to my buried Jeep and began clearing snow with an efficiency that was breathtaking. In 20 minutes they'd accomplished what would have taken me all day, but they didn't stop there. Working together with a coordination that spoke of long partnership, they lifted my Jeep, actually lifted it, and carried it to higher ground where the snow was shallower. Then they began clearing the access road, their powerful hands and feet moving tons of snow in a matter of hours. I watched in amazement, occasionally trying to help, though my efforts were laughably inadequate compared to theirs. They worked without speaking, communicating through glances and subtle gestures. When they finished, the road was passable all the way to the main trail. My original visitor approached me as the others disappeared back into the forest. It looked at me for a long moment, then placed one enormous hand gently on my shoulder. The gesture was unmistakably protective, almost paternal. Then it too walked away, leaving me standing beside my rescued Jeep in the gathering dusk. I could have left then. Should have left, probably. The road was clear, my Jeep was running, and I had a clear path back to civilization. Instead, I found myself walking back to the cabin, drawn by something I couldn't name but couldn't resist. That evening, my visitor returned as usual, but the dynamic between us had changed. Where before there had been curious distance, now there was something like friendship. It brought another gift, a piece of quartz crystal the size of my fist, so clear it seemed to hold light. When I examined it closely, I could see that it had been deliberately shaped, worked by intelligent hands into something approaching art. Over the following days, our relationship deepened in ways I'm still struggling to understand. It began bringing me food, nuts, berries, even fish from streams I hadn't known existed. It showed me hidden paths through the forest, places of extraordinary beauty that I never would have found on my own. But more than that, it taught me things: how to read the weather in the behavior of birds, how to find direction when the sky was clouded, how to move through the forest without sound, how to see tracks and signs I'd never noticed before, not through words, but through patient demonstration and gentle correction when I misunderstood. There was one evening when it led me to a clearing I'd never seen before, a natural amphitheater surrounded by ancient pines. In the center grew a single enormous tree, easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches reaching toward stars that seemed unusually bright. My companion sat at the base of this tree and gestured for me to join it. We sat in comfortable silence for what felt like hours, just existing in that sacred space. I found my mind emptying of the concerns and anxieties that had driven me to the mountains in the first place. For the first time in months, possibly years, I felt truly peaceful. When I finally looked over at my companion, I found it watching me with those intelligent eyes. And in that moment, I understood something profound about connection and community and the different forms that understanding could take. "Thank you," I whispered into the starlit quiet. The sound it made in response wasn't quite like the communications I'd heard before. It was softer, more complex, and it carried what I could only interpret as affection. The weather held for nearly a week, giving us time to establish something that felt like real communication. It learned to interpret my gestures and expressions, while I began to understand the subtle variations in its vocalizations. We developed something like a shared vocabulary of movement and sound. It was during one of our evening sessions that I realized it was trying to show me something specific. For 3 nights running, it had led me to the edge of a steep ravine on the north side of my clearing. Each time, it would point into the darkness below and make urgent sounds, but I couldn't understand what it wanted me to see. On the 4th night, I brought a flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow path, zigzagging down the ravine wall, invisible from above but clearly used regularly. At the bottom, I could make out what looked like the mouth of a cave. My companion gestured emphatically toward this opening, then looked at me expectantly. "You want me to go down there?" I asked. The nod was unmistakable. The path was treacherous, especially in the dark, but my companion moved ahead of me, testing each step and occasionally steadying me with a careful hand. Its night vision was clearly superior to mine, and more than once it stopped me just before I would have stepped off into empty air. The cave mouth was larger than it had appeared from above, easily tall enough for even my companion to enter upright. But it was what lay beyond that took my breath away. The cavern opened into a vast underground space, lit by some source I couldn't immediately identify. The walls were covered in what I first took to be natural rock formations, but gradually realized were intentional, not quite carvings, but careful arrangements of stone that created patterns of shadow and light. And it wasn't empty. Throughout the cavern, other creatures like my companion moved with quiet purpose. Some were tending what appeared to be underground gardens. How plants could grow without sunlight was beyond my understanding, but they were thriving. Others seemed to be engaged in activities I couldn't interpret, but that clearly had meaning and structure. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a home, a community, a civilization. My companion led me deeper into the cavern. And I began to understand that what I was seeing was both ancient and carefully maintained. The stone arrangements weren't random, but told stories. Migration patterns, seasonal changes, relationships between the surface world and this hidden realm below. We were approached by others, and I realized with a start that some were smaller than my companion, possibly younger. They examined me with the same careful intelligence I'd grown accustomed to, but with an additional quality that seemed like wonder. It occurred to me that I might be the first human they'd ever seen up close. The interaction that followed is difficult to describe. Without words, I was welcomed, shown around, offered food that was both strange and somehow familiar. I was introduced, there's no other word for it, to what seemed like family groups and given what could only be called a tour of their home. I learned things that night that challenged everything I thought I knew about intelligence, community, and the natural world. These creatures weren't primitive or savage. They had technology, but it was technology based on understanding natural processes rather than dominating them. They had agriculture that worked with underground water systems and natural light sources I couldn't identify. They had art, storytelling, what seemed like historical records maintained in stone and shadow, and they had been watching the surface world for longer than I could comprehend. Through patient demonstration and gentle guidance, my companion showed me carvings that depicted interactions with humans going back generations. Not all of these encounters had been positive. I saw images that suggested conflict, misunderstanding, fear on both sides. But there were others that showed cooperation, shared knowledge, mutual aid. I was seeing the visual history of a people who had chosen to remain hidden, not out of primitiveness, but out of wisdom. They had learned that the surface world could be dangerous for those who were different, those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to narrow definitions of normal. When my companion finally led me back to the surface, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with dawn. I was exhausted but exhilarated, my mind reeling with everything I'd experienced. As we emerged from the cave, I turned to look back, but the entrance had seemingly vanished, hidden by an arrangement of stones and shadows so clever that I had to remind myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. We climbed back up the ravine path in comfortable silence, my companion occasionally steadying me when fatigue made me clumsy. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was painting the mountain peaks in shades of pink and gold. I slept most of that day, waking in late afternoon, with memories that seemed too vivid to be dreams but too extraordinary to be real. But when I stepped outside, I found new gifts beside my door, vegetables I didn't recognize, but that proved to be delicious, and a small carving that depicted the two of us sitting together beneath stars. That evening, when my companion appeared as usual, there was something different in its demeanor. More formal somehow, more serious. It approached closer than it ever had before and placed both hands on my shoulders, looking directly into my eyes. What followed was the most complex communication we'd ever attempted. Through a combination of gesture, expression, and careful vocalization, it conveyed something that took me several minutes to understand. The weather was changing. Another storm was coming, bigger than the last one. I needed to leave soon. But more than that, our time together was ending. Not just because of the weather, but because it was necessary. The hidden world it had shown me was exactly that, hidden. My presence, however welcome, represented a risk to its people that couldn't be sustained. I understood, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. We spent what we both knew would be our last evening together, sitting in our usual spot, but closer than ever before. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of its massive body, close enough to hear the steady rhythm of its breathing, close enough to understand, without words, that this impossible friendship had been as meaningful to it as it had been to me. When it finally rose to leave, it handed me something, a small pouch made from woven plant fibers containing seeds I didn't recognize. Through gesture, it conveyed that these were to be planted in my world below, in memory of what we'd shared. I wanted to say so many things. Thank you seemed inadequate. Goodbye felt too final. Instead, I simply placed my hand on its arm and tried to convey through touch what words couldn't express. It understood. With a final, gentle touch to my face, it walked backward into the forest, never taking its eyes off me until the shadows swallowed it completely. I left the next morning, just ahead of storm clouds that looked like they meant business. The drive down the mountain was harder than I'd expected, not because of road conditions, but because every mile took me further from something I might never experience again. But I took with me more than memories. The seeds my friend had given me are planted now in a small garden behind my house in Denver. Some have grown into plants I can't identify, but that seem to thrive in urban soil. And sometimes, especially on quiet evenings, I swear I can feel something watching over them, watching over me. I've never told this story to anyone before now. Who would believe it? But I've carried it with me every day for the past 6 months, and I've found it changing me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more patient now, more observant. I notice things I used to miss. The language of bird flight, the stories told by animal tracks, the subtle communications that happen without words. And I understand something now about loneliness that I never grasped before. Real connection, the kind that changes you, doesn't require similarity or even shared species. It requires only recognition, respect, and the willingness to see intelligence and dignity in forms that might challenge your assumptions. The rescue team that found me called it a miracle. Stranded by an unexpected blizzard, no supplies, no survival training, and I'd emerged unharmed after 12 days. They couldn't understand how I'd found food, how I'd stayed warm, how I'd known which direction to travel when the weather cleared. I didn't try to explain about the gifts of food that appeared outside my shelter each morning, or about the carefully arranged windbreaks that kept the worst of the storm away from where I was trapped, or about the clear path through the forest that I followed to safety, marked by subtle signs that only I seemed able to see. They called it luck, determination, natural instinct. I know better. Somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, there are people who chose long ago to step back from a world that had no place for them. They built something better, something sustainable, something based on cooperation rather than competition. And for a few precious weeks, I was privileged to witness it. More than that, I was helped by it, saved by it, loved by it, in ways that transcend anything I thought I understood about love. The Wendigo, according to legend, is a creature of endless hunger, cursed to wander and consume. But legends, I've learned, are often written by those who never got close enough to see truth. What I encountered in those mountains was something far different, something ancient and wise and infinitely patient, something that understood that sometimes salvation comes not from conquering wilderness, but from learning to live as part of it. I think about that often now. Here in the city, where the loudest sound is never whined through pine branches and the brightest light never comes from stars. I think about underground gardens and stone stories and communication that happens in silence. And I think about eyes that held intelligence older than civilization, and hands that could tear trees apart but chose instead to offer gifts of welcome to a stranger. The world is stranger and more wonderful than we imagine. I know this now, with a certainty that needs no proof, no validation from others who weren't there. In the space between legend and reality, between the possible and the impossible, there are beings who chose compassion over conquest, wisdom over dominance, and sometimes, if you're very lucky and very lost, they choose to save you. Not from the mountains, from yourself. I've returned to those mountains twice since then. Not to the same cabin, that felt like trespassing on sacred ground, but to nearby areas hoping for some sign, some indication that what I experienced was real and lasting. I never saw my friend again, but I found things, arrangements of stones that couldn't be natural, paths that appeared overnight when none had existed before. And once, just once, I found footprints in morning frost that were gone by the time I returned with a camera. The seeds have grown into something beautiful. My neighbors admire my unusual garden, asking where I found such exotic plants. I tell them they're native species, which isn't exactly a lie. They're native to somewhere. 6 months have passed since my rescue, and I'm a different person. The divorce that sent me fleeing to the mountains seems like it happened to someone else. The job I hated, I quit. I work now for the Forest Service, spending my days in wild places, ostensibly cataloguing plant species, but really just listening for sounds that might be more than wind, watching for movements that might be more than shadows, hoping, always hoping, that somewhere in the vast wilderness, ancient wisdom still walks upright under starlight. The official report called my survival miraculous. 12 days alone in a mountain blizzard with minimal supplies, emerging unharmed and well-fed. The investigators noted evidence of unusual animal activity around my shelter, but attributed it to natural scavenging behavior. They found the gifts I'd been given, the carved stones, the crystal, the woven pouch, and labeled them artifacts of unknown origin, possibly Native American. They're in a box somewhere now, filed away as curiosities, but I know the truth, and sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and the world feels thin between what is and what might be, I speak that truth aloud to my garden of impossible plants. Thank you, I whisper to the darkness, for showing me that monsters are often just misunderstood friends, for teaching me that salvation comes in forms we never expect, for proving that the world holds more wonder than we dare imagine. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear an answer, deep, gentle, carrying the wisdom of mountains and the patience of ages. The Wendigo saved me. Not the creature of legend, hungry and cursed, but something far more beautiful, a guardian, a teacher, a friend who understood that sometimes the greatest rescue is showing someone they were never truly alone. My name is David Mitchell, and this is my story, every impossible, transformative word of it.